Hello everybody and welcome back to Friends of Scales. This is episode 3. We are going to be talking about a topic that I really wanted to discuss, especially with a couple of the changes that have been happening recently in our state of Vermont. And the topic is going to be about what really happens when you release a reptile into the wild. So there's a lot of things to discuss with this. I've brought in a few animals under the table here that we will be taking out throughout to help us talk about this a little bit. But the first thing I want to talk about before we even bring any animals out is why people would release animals. So in general, people release animals for one of 4 reasons. The first reason is the animal grows to an unexpected size. The second reason is that they get overwhelmed by the care requirements needed for the animal. The third reason is some kind of housing change. You know, they're going from a house they could have it to maybe they're getting an apartment and they aren't allowed to have the animal. And then the fourth reason could possibly be, you know, they have the animal, they're okay with it, but they're getting bigger or they just think that it is the right thing and a more fair thing to do for the animal to release them into the wild. I want to debunk all of these and kind of explain why in 90% of the cases it's the wrong thing for the animal, and in the other 10% of the cases it's the wrong thing for the environment. So we'll start off by talking about corn snakes. And we're going to use these guys as our example for unexpected size. So these are 2 corn snakes here. This right here is a baby corn snake. This is a snake that you would probably see at, you know, a local chain pet store, or, you know, maybe you even, you know, wanted to buy from a breeder, or, you know, you went to a more specialized reptile store. This is probably the size that you are going to be sold with, is these little cute tiny babies. You know, they can live in a little 10-gallon tank. You know, they're small and active, so, you know, you don't think too much of it. And a lot of times people don't realize that this little snake, within as short a time as, you know, a year and a half, maybe 2 years, you know, however long it takes for them to grow depending on the different circumstances, that little snake can very quickly grow up and become a much larger snake. So this is an adult corn snake. This is actually kind of a small adult corn snake. A lot of them can get larger than this. This is Dane. He's one of our oldest snakes. Dane here is about 11 years old now. He was a rescue that we took in. He actually got shipped up from Florida. But, you know, this is a big reason why people will release them. They'll get that little baby not realizing they get this big, and then they'll go, oh, well, you know, I can't care for it anymore. You know, rehoming doesn't feel right because how do I know that the person I'm giving it to is going to take care of it? You know what, they're wild animals. Let's just put them back into the wild. So I wanted to bring these out to talk about that real quick, but the biggest thing that I want to talk about is kind of the consequences for the animal and the environment. So almost all animals that you're going to find in the pet trade are probably not going to be native to your region. There are exceptions, but for the most part, pet stores are really only allowed to sell non-native species. And what happens is when a non-native species gets released into the wild is one of 2 things. Either that species is going to fail and not survive, or it is going to do too well and then it's going to be an invasive species. And that's not even to mention the other possibility of that individual having some kind of communicable disease that could be spread to the other wildlife that wildlife wouldn't be prepared or have a method of fighting off, which is an entire another issue in and of itself. We'll talk a little bit more about what can happen to the environment later. What I want to focus on first is what happens to the animal. So, this is Rambo. Rambo here is a Argentine black and white Tegu. Now, as you know, or as I believe I've mentioned, we are, located out of Vermont. That's where the filming is. That is where I am located and I am based off of. Rambo here came to us from a home up in Burlington, Vermont. So we don't know a whole lot about his first home. We do know about his second home. His second home was by a couple of individuals, very friendly people. They tried to do everything right for him, but ultimately they just didn't have the resources to give him what he needed. So they contacted me. But what I have learned from them about his first home, he was kept in an enclosure that was far too small, that caused him to be stunted, which we have gone over in our last episode. But more than that, after their first home got bored of him, they released him into the wild. And the estimate is that he lived in the woods for a little over a week. Now, luckily, they released him into the wild in summer, but had he, not been found, or had they released him even when it was just a little bit colder, these reptiles are not equipped to be able to survive a Vermont climate. And he would have passed away once winter came and the temperatures started to cool down. Now, when Rambo was found in the wild, he was incredibly skinny. Captive bred animals, well, all animals are born with some instinct. Captive bred animals who are handed food to them for their entire lives don't have the hunting instincts of a normal wild animal. He wasn't able to successfully hunt out in the wild. So when he was found, he was incredibly skinny and very, very malnourished because he wasn't able to actually catch anything. And that kind of applies for more than just him. He's a big lizard that's obviously not anything like anything that we have up here in Vermont, but that can apply for even other animals that you would think would do well. Tortoises that you think would do well might not either be able to survive the climate or they might not be able to find food. Turtles could either get outcompeted for food in local ponds or they could outcompete the other turtles that live in the area. Snakes might not be their hunting skills might not be quite developed enough to actually catch and kill wild mice and insects. For the most part up here, our biggest problem is our weather, that they just cannot survive the cold, they can't survive the weather. So usually releasing an animal into the wild means a death sentence for the animal. Now, in contrast, let's go the other way here. Let's say you release an animal into the wild and it actually does survive, and it does do really well. Well, that's problematic as well. So if you release an animal into the wild who does survive and does do very well, oftentimes that animal can become what's known as an invasive species. Or it can, even if it doesn't become a full invasive species, it can outcompete other local species for food, resources, or just in general complicate other species doing well. Now, it's kind of been all over the news that recently, as of the 1st of July, Vermont just passed a new law that prohibits pet stores from selling a very common pet turtle known as a red ear slider. I wanted to talk briefly about that law because there are a couple misconceptions about what it means, and I just want to use this platform to clear up that a little bit. But I also then want to talk about the why that happened and why, I've seen a lot of people not really understanding the purpose of that law. So the first thing I want to debunk about this new law is that this does not mean you have to get rid of your red ear sliders, and it certainly does not mean you should release them into the pond for fear of if you got caught with one. So long as you had your pet red ear slider before the law took effect, you can keep them. So this is one of my red ear sliders. I have quite a few of them that I bought before the laws changed, bought and rescued. But because I had them before the law took effect, that does not means that I can have them. I don't have to give them up. I don't have to get rid of them, which is one of the big things I wanted to say, because I've seen a lot of people thinking that they need to get rid of their red ear sliders or they're going to be fined or arrested, but you certainly don't need to get rid of them, and you definitely don't want them to be released into the wild. So why did Vermont make this change? Why did Vermont ban red ear sliders from being sold within the state? Why is Vermont banning people from keeping them or getting them in the future? Well, the problem is because they were getting released into the wild. They were getting released into ponds, into rivers, into lakes up here in Vermont, and are becoming something of an invasive species. Red ear sliders are very hardy. They're very resilient animals. They are from a very similar climate to what we find up here, so they've thrived in our ecosystem. And not only have they thrived, they're also outcompeting local native turtles for food, resources, and even in some occasions they'll fight with the local native turtles and injure them. Now, red ear sliders, to my knowledge, don't have any diseases that they can transmit, though that would just be another bad thing that happens. Regardless of if they have diseases, they have been affecting the ecosystem, which is why they are being banned. Now, one of the big reasons people are releasing these is because, just like with the corn snake, this is the size you see at pet stores. This is the size people buy and think, oh, they're going to stay this size. But in reality, red ear sliders get this big, which, although it's certainly not anything insane, this is a lot bigger than that little baby I just had out here, and they require a lot more food, space, and time and care because of their big size. Their big size also means that they're able to compete with local wildlife very effectively. They're, resilient, and they've adapted to our conditions up here. So the whole purpose of the law is to protect local wildlife. The purpose of the law is to protect, the wildlife, the ecosystem, and in part protect the turtles, because although they do often thrive up here, this is not their native habitat. Some captive turtles may not have the instincts to be able to successfully survive in Vermont's climate. So we've kind of covered why it's bad for the animal. This is probably going to be a bit of a shorter episode. We've covered why it's bad for the animal, that, if you release an animal who's not equipped to live in the ecosystem, the animal will likely not survive. We've also kind of covered why it's not good for the environment, because if you release an animal and it is able to thrive in the ecosystem, it can become an invasive species. A couple of, more famous examples of this is the Burmese pythons in the Florida Everglades. They were released, people had them as pets, and they released them because they thought that they'd do better in the wild, and they did. And they did way, way better than any of the native species, and now it's a very large problem in Florida. And, Florida has to hire people to come in and remove them and put them down, which is, unfortunate for the animals, but it's now become a necessary evil. So, a lot of times you think it's a good thing, you think you're doing a good thing by releasing them into the wild because, they're wild animals. They should return to the wild and thrive, but in almost every circumstance, it's either going to end badly for the animal, or it's going to end badly for the other native animals that are in the area. Because even if, Rambo here, Rambo that you met earlier, even if he wouldn't have survived, in the time that he was out, if, let's say he had a bit, stronger limbs and a little bit more hunting instinct, he could have done some serious damage to the local population of animals while he was alive out there. So, I wanted to talk about this. It's a bit of a shorter topic. But at the very end here, what I would like to talk about is some alternatives to releasing reptiles. So, a lot of people feel a little bit bad about rehoming animals because you don't know if they're going to get the care they need. What I often recommend for that is to try to find somewhere like a zoo, or really, vet your people that you're rehoming to. If you don't want to rehome your animal to somebody you don't fully trust, vet them. Make them give you references, get vet references. Do a little, check into, do they have any other animals? How's, their other animals' care look like? You can check into them, or you can also contact places. There are places that will take in animals. Local pet stores, we take in animals. Captain Aquatics Fins and Scales, most of our animals are rescues that we take in from other people. And we care for and try to, give them the best lives that they can possibly have. But honestly, the biggest preventative measure that can be taken to prevent animals from getting released back into the wild, the biggest preventative measure that can be taken is to research and really know what you're getting into when you get an animal. Know what their care is going to be, know what their lifespan is going to be, know how big they're going to get, how much money they're going to cost you. Just be aware of the cost that you're getting yourself into, because in reality, it's stressful for an animal to have to move homes and situations. A lot of times the rescues we get in aren't in great health because, it's all misinformation. The people that rehome them aren't bad people. They're just misinformed and don't know how to do it properly. And the biggest step that can be taken to prevent rehoming, to prevent being released into the wild, to prevent all of these issues is just to know what you're getting into when you first get a reptile. So that is going to be it for this episode. Bit of a shorter episode today, but I wanted to cover this topic. I know it wasn't the most exciting topic ever, but I hope that you guys did learn something from it. And I hope that this has, taught you a little bit about why it's better to rehome than it is to release into the wild, and also that there are outlets out there that you can rehome to. Local small businesses such as myself, if you don't want to go with me, there's, pet stores in the area, or there's tons of online groups that you can go to try to find a new home, full of enthusiasts and people who are interested in the exact thing you are trying to find a home for. This has been Alex Knapp with Captain Aquatics Fins and Scales, and I hope you all have a nice day. I'll see you next time.